why probably Norway and the EU has found some kind of solutions. But now we enter some specific fields, and I think that instead of discussing these things in detail, I think we should we could of course read, and we are ready to discuss all of our arguments anytime. Now let me take this opportunity to say that I'll talk for 15-20 minutes or something, so we open up for a general discussion. As Fredrik said, the main story about the consequences for Norway is that 3 or 4 points. This is an agreement that has worked well, served Norwegian interest, it's a political compromise, and it's fairly stable and robust. Now, that doesn't mean, and to some extent, it has served as an equilibrium, a domestic, stable equilibrium. That doesn't mean that this is stable, fixed, permanent, lasting for, I think Jonas Gahr Støre said, another 20 years. He said on Tuesday. It was a bit surprising, because if you look into, and I guess you and your experiences can tell that maybe many of you don't think it will last for another 20 years. Anyway, could I have... I can use this one here. So I take this opportunity to take you into 3 different issues related to the model. I'll say something about some of the perspectives. We've heard a bit of the Norwegian perspectives on the model, and then I will say something about the model properties, the features of the model. And then towards the end I will say something about the challenges. And this is then basically what we deal about in chapter 13 and chapter 27. So, what is the view of the EEA from the EU? Basically, it's what we write is that basically the EU is saying that the only problem with Norway is that there is no problem. This is the EEA is an agreement that the EU has never considered to renegotiate or terminate. It's never been a subject for serious discussions in the EU to terminate this agreement. So it's a very solid agreement, not only on the EFTA side but also on the EU side. And the EU considered this to be the most effective, well-functioning agreement with other third parties. There are numerous other neighborhood policies, etc., but this is the most successful one. And if you study the rhetoric of the EU, you will see they talk warmly about the EEA and try to talk less warmly and less respectfully about the Swiss accident, as we heard. Another interesting point is that in the EU they see this as a privileged partnership. The EU see the EEA relationship as a privileged partnership. This is in contrast to what we see in Norway, where this agreement is often termed a slave contract. But from the EU it's seen as a privileged partnership. And then you have this funny constellation of the EFTA partners. You have this stamp here. Last year we celebrated the 2 years ago we celebrated the 50 years anniversary of EFTA. It's a very funny, interesting organization that fails to die out. And in the report we somehow tell a bit of the story of EFTA. It's a story of decline. But at the same time as EFTA has lost member states, more and more people are working in EFTA. It's an amazing study. I'm a student of organizational theory myself, and it's an amazing example of how an organization might grow and grow, but at the same time become smaller and smaller. And so you see the stamp there of all the previous EFTA member states, the UK, Sweden, Austria, Portugal, Finland, etc. And now the 4 ones in the left. These states have few mutual interests. It's a historical accident that they are joined together, and of course there are historical bonds between Norway and Iceland, but they also have quite competing interests sometimes. But in the report we try to lift this up and to show how these EFTA countries, some alpine states and some maritime states on the high north, wouldn't even go into all the details about the discrepancies between the moral self-esteem of Norwegian foreign policy compared to the tax evasion, democratic deficits or concerns in Liechtenstein. I should stress one point. We are not representing the Norwegian government. We are an independent committee. I shouldn't say that. And we don't have any obligation to act as diplomats as such. Well, no, I'm just these countries are bound together in shared institutions, and they have developed very strong interdependencies. If Liechtenstein failed to, as they did in 2004, had concerns about the enlargement of the EEA, that postponed the enlargement of the EEA for the other countries as well. So we point to these structural interlinkages that is often forgotten in the Norwegian public debate. We had, Fredrik mentioned, we had a report from the Liechtenstein scholars and from the Icelandic scholars. We also have public reports from Liechtenstein and Iceland, and we have looked into them. And basically, the story is the story of we describe about Norway is also consistent with the story in Iceland and Liechtenstein. They are also happy with the EEA. They have positive experience of the EEA agreement. They find that the EEA agreement, this model association, has served their interests and values. And also they point to the internal EEA EFTA cooperation has functioned well. At the same time, there are several differences in interests, differences in capacities that might sometimes be frustrating, and there are differences in domestic procedures. Many of you have been working in EFTA, and you know issues about transparency, access to public documents, all these things. There have been different issues that are sometimes troublesome. And Norway have been acting as somehow a great power in this organization. Not always as Norway would like other great powers to act in other organizations. Okay, and then say something about model properties. This is an illustration from this Plux report that we mentioned. It's from Per Elvestuen, a cartoonist and actually soldier, pro-soldier in Afghanistan. This guy says, EEA, who is she? This is from Plus Luxembourg. Some model features. I'll just run through these very quickly. I guess most of you are familiar with them. So the first is, this is a very extensive agreement. There's no coherent institutional framework. Of course, there is a coherent institutional framework within the EEA, but the whole patchwork of agreement is inconsistent and not coherent. And another property is that there is no material specific EEA content to the law. There's some procedural issues, but in the material content it's EU law. This is an association agreement. And then of course it's dynamic. There's no time limit to it. This is what we could call an open-ended delegation. It's reactive, it's asymmetric, there's no agenda function for the EFTA side in the construction. And as Fredrik pointed to, there's a discrepancy between the formal and actual delegation of sovereignty. In the setup, it looks a bit like it's limited delegation of formal powers, whereas in reality it's massive delegation of sovereignty. I think in the report we say that there is no parallel to this acquisition of law in Norwegian history since
since the incorporation of canonic Christian law in Norway in the Middle Ages.
Yeah. There you have it. And then this is a domestic compromise. It's the second best solution. Nobody really prefers it. It has some depoliticizing effects since politicians are not involved, whereas you bureaucrats, experts run the show. Politicians are not engaged in it, and since they're not engaged in it, the media is not engaged in it, etc., etc. So it's a very peculiar mode of association to the EU. In fact, we have tried to look around in the world to see whether there are other organizations that are similar, and the only thing that we found that were resembling this was the way Puerto Rico is linked to the US. It's actually a very strange mode. One could say we could start laughing, but at the same time we could kind of somehow. It's a very innovative construction in international relations. It's, as we have pointed to and documented in 911 pages, it's functioned well. The market actors are happy, politicians are happy, citizens are happy, but at the same time it has some kind of strange features to it. It's a unique model. The second point is others have found it unattractive. It suits Norway. Have suited Iceland for quite some time, and it has suited Liechtenstein, but others have found it unattractive, and that is Switzerland. They turn around in the door right before entering it. Sweden, Finland, Austria, they left after a year, and ever since very few have found this model attractive. There's been a few countries who have been approaching, thinking about maybe this could be something for us, and Slovenia, and Slovenia did this, and there have been a few other attempts at kind of at least looking into it, but nobody has seriously seriously considered membership in EFTA or the EEA in this respect. And in addition, there's been no attempt from the EFTA side to promote this model to others either. So it's this strange club of these three countries that these countries are happy with, but at the same time it's not attractive for others, and they don't promote it to others. Point to some challenges. First, there's this what we could call in the report we discuss also a lot of the democratic challenges, constitutional challenges. I'll leave them aside now because they are more internal Norwegian. First is the political administrative challenges. The report documents very clearly, and what you probably many of you know, that there's a bias between involvement by bureaucrats, technocrats, with limited involvement by politicians, both the executive and cabinet people and parliamentarians. And this creates also few incentives for the administration, so this has a trickle-down effect. And it's increasingly difficult to ensure some kind of participation and influences at the early stages. And this has also, of course, implications for the level of knowledge and competence in national administrations. And then there's this list of issues, developments in the EU that is challenging for the EEA. And I think this list is not very original. You've probably thought through it yourself. So it's a story of increasing asymmetry between the EFTA and the EU. It's kind of the pillar and the toothpick. And then there's the changing institutional balance in the EU, abolishment of the pillar structure, making it increasingly difficult to see the relevance. What should go into the EEA, what should be kept out of the EEA. There's the development of increasing number of agencies in the EU that raises constitutional issues, and you have the whole development in the foreign security policy, the EEAS. I'll do this very quickly so we have good time for questions. And then there's some challenges in EFTA, EEA. And this is Jonas Gahr Støre. It's not a very nice drawing of him, but it's the fact that Iceland is leaving, moving into the EU, means nothing for us. And in the report we discuss a bit about what would be the critical mass. How many countries could you have in an international organization before it ceases to end as an international organization and becomes kind of a bilateral organization? Of course, it's a critical issue. Exit Iceland, what would happen? Could you continue EFTA with 3 countries? Norway and LIECHTENSTEIN? Could you continue the EEA? Could you continue the EFTA Secretariat? Why should you do it? Could you have EFTA Surveillance Authority? Could you have EFTA Court with 2 countries? These issues. Should you move on to extend EFTA? Should you bring in other microstates? Andorra, San Marino, etc. Should what would be the development? We discussed these issues in the report. Yeah. And then just brief remark on some of the institutions that I know that some of you work on. In the report, we, as Fredrik mentioned, we try to empower the EFTA Secretariat. We show the important work you do and say that you are critical for the actual ticking of the EEA agreement. And in fact, we are critical to the turnover mechanism in the high turnover in the EFTA system, because it reduces the competence and capacity of the institution. And we also think that if you're concerned with homogeneity, you should have more capacity to and powers to push member states to speed up their relevance interpretations. And then EFTA Surveillance Authority, the committee, not we, I'm not a member of the committee, the committee. The committee recognizes 2 points for both the EFTA Surveillance Authority and the EFTA Court. And the first is that both the EFTA Court and the EFTA Surveillance Authority, I think a unanimous committee recognizes the importance of these institutions for the functioning of the EEA agreement. And this is a non-trivial statement in Norway. So we kind of say that these are critical for the functioning of the EEA agreement. The second point is that we recognize that both of these institutions are conducting an extremely difficult balancing act. On the one hand, they need to interpret the rules more or less as they think the Commission or the EU Court of Justice would rule in a similar case. And of course this is by definition impossible in some sense. Sometimes you might be too strict, sometimes you might be too lax. And what we say is that this is a very difficult balancing act, and both of these institutions, the EFTA Court and the EFTA Surveillance Authority, have conducted and behaved well in the sense that they have been successful in treading this line. And footnote here, I understood that Carl Bovnebakker was very critical to the report this morning. We were not here, unfortunately. But I must say that it's very surprising. I think that it's based on some kind of misperception of what, some kind of future expectation of what would be in the report if Fredrik wrote the report solely by himself, if anything. Okay, but this is what we say about the that I can say. Right? Right. Okay, this is the what we say about, basically what we say about the EFTA Court. It's critical for the functioning of the EFTA, so we recognize the court, no problem with that. We say there's a problem with a few cases, too few cases. The number of judges is maybe too limited in big cases, and we say that national courts have been too restrictive to send cases. And when we could also add the EFTA Surveillance Authority have been too restrictive to submit cases or refer cases to the EFTA Court. I think President Ballbacher would be happy to hear this. And also, we are supporting some of the reform proposals that he is advocating for the reform of the court. But the committee itself is not taking a stand to all his proposals, but because we found it inappropriate that a Norwegian committee should have a view of a court owned by several other countries. But we encourage the Norwegian government to, together with the other EFTA partners, to reflect upon the reform proposals and to move on this. And then this is rolling the dice for the different EEA institutions. So this is the final one, the Financial Mechanism Office. That's the footprint, yeah. It's like yeah. So and we are very supportive. The committee is supportive to the financial mechanism. We have a very, I would say, a radical proposal. Strangely enough, it's not picked up yet in the newspaper or by any politicians. But we actually think that the financial mechanism arrangement has been something that was not initially in the agreement, but it has been there. It's becoming more or less a de facto integrated part of the agreement. And so we, instead of having difficult negotiations at every crossroad, every fourth or fifth year, the committee recommends that the Norwegian government, together with the EFTA partners, take steps in order to see if they can find some way to make the arrangement permanent, but then negotiate the terms for this agreement, and fixing somehow the way and mode of calculating the contribution. Because as it is today, this is rather, the EFTA side is putting themselves in a rather vulnerable position of negotiating these mechanism arrangements. You can read more about what we say about the FMO, etc. And then I should say just a few things towards the end. As Fredrik mentioned, we are not in the position of making proposals for the whole, whether you should move out of the EEA, but we say here are some issues that is worth considering for reforming the EEA agreement. So then we have a discussion. Would it be nice to have a coherent framework around all these 74 agreements? Should we incorporate everything into the EEA, or should we find something else? So we discuss these issues. And this is somehow a reply to the EU member states who in December 2010 said that they would review the EEA agreement and look into the possibility of having some kind of coherent framework. So we have done this exercise, listing 10 arguments pro and 10 arguments con for having this coherent framework. And then we run through, if you can't have a coherent framework for all agreements, could you have a coherent framework for the agreements within the justice and home affairs, etc., etc. So I wouldn't go into all these reform proposals, but we encourage you to look into that. It's in the end of chapter 27 and also in chapter 28. Okay, I think I'll stop there, and then we open up for discussion, and then I guess you can ask questions to me and to Fredrik. Yeah. Very much.
Hello, my name is Olav Reynarsson. I'm Director of Internal Market at the EFTA Surveillance Authority, and I have read chapter 7, isn't it, of your report, and I think indeed the authority gets rather good reviews. I would especially like to welcome that the famous or infamous contention that the authority is more Catholic than the Pope has, I think, rather convincingly been refuted. But I would like just to pick up on what Ulf said. Is the message of the committee then that the EFTA Surveillance Authority should be taking more cases forward? And I don't think, I noticed you said that now, but I didn't read the report like that. And then would Fredrik Sejersted say, agree to that taking the Waterfalls case to the EFTA Court was a good decision?
Yeah.
Fredrik Sejersted definitely agrees that taking the Waterfall case to today, that was it a good decision? No, I'm not sure if it was a good decision or not, but it turned out well in the end. That's what I think about the Waterfall case. I will not make a comment on whether it was a good decision or not. I think it was a bad decision to take the gaming machine to the court. That was a wrong decision. But that's the only thing I think the EFTA Surveillance Authority really went too far and was more Catholic, definitely in the gaming policy. And that's a long story. Waterfalls, I don't think it was wrong to take it to the court. And it ended up in a very satisfactory manner. So I would say that the only thing, betting policy was wrong. But overall, absolutely, I mean, the findings of the report, but this is not new. Ulf Sverdrup did a report 10 years ago for the NHO measuring whether the EFTA Surveillance Authority is more Catholic than the Pope. And the answer was no 10 years ago, and is definitely empirically no today. Whether we are advocating that it should be more strict in its control, no, I don't think we are advocating that. We are not saying anything on that. But we are saying there is absolutely no evidence that you are too strict. And what we are really saying, I mean, the main message is not that you this or that. It's a recognition of the difficult role, the vital, necessary, but difficult role of the EFTA Surveillance Authority and the EFTA Court. That's what it should take home, that the committee recognizes this. These institutions are vital to the arrangement, and it's a very difficult balancing act. And always when you balance for 20 years, you might go a little bit this way and you might go a little bit that way, and there might be. So I'm not really being critical when I'm saying that, well, in the betting cases you went too far one way. Perhaps in other cases you have postponed treating the cases for too long, and you should pick up the cases and make them more expedient. So, but we are not. I think we should say that we are really not making. We have thoughts on the EFTA structure, the EFTA Secretariat, the EFTA Surveillance Authority, the EFTA Court, etc. We are not assessing these institutions as such. We have not done independent, in-depth analysis of this. So this is not on this level. We are saying, however, at the end of the report that perhaps time has come for these kind of assessments. Respecting, of course, the independence of the institutions concerned, but perhaps time has come after 20 years for making, and it would have to be a little bit different for the EFTA Secretariat, which is under the auspices of the member state, and for the EFTA Surveillance Authority and the EFTA Court. But perhaps time has come for institutional evaluation of how these institutions work. This is what we're saying. And we are saying that this whole expression, which in Norway is more or less Catholic than the Pope, it's a kind of stupid kind of expression. So we are really distancing ourselves from it. At the same time, since it's used, we are answering it. And the answer is, for the EFTA Surveillance Authority, it's no. For the EFTA Court, it's more a question mark. And this is not because we have done the analysis, but there's been very good legal research on this in Norway in the last couple of years, which have shown, and in my view, I've not done it myself, but in my view, very convincingly, that perhaps the EFTA Court is a bit more, I hate to use the expression, more Catholic than the Pope. And we are saying that if this is so, it should be careful, because that is undermining the authority of the court. But we are very supportive of the court and very supportive of the authority. So we are concerned about the functioning of these arrangements and institutions.
Well, I'm Knut Almestad. I'm not quite sure how I should present myself, probably as the dinosaur. But I would like, first of all, to commend the committee for having delivered a not very thick report, fat report, but also a very interesting and readable report. At the same time, as I would commend the quality of the work, I must say that I'm surprised and perhaps also a bit saddened that a report which basically tells that an agreement which functioned the way it was meant to function causes such big headlines. But it's all in the good cause, so thank you for that. I should also like to thank you for having now, after so many years, been absolved, to stay in the terminology, from the accusation from some quarters that the ESA which I used to lead and my successors have been more Catholic than the Pope. You know how it is in staunch Protestant countries to have such a label, particularly if you live in a mixed religio marriage. But I would like to put the question to you whether perhaps the kind of praise that you give to the EFTA Surveillance Authority for having sort of been able to strike or perform, I should say, a good balancing act between whatever, because I don't think that that is what the Surveillance Authority should do. The Surveillance Authority is basically concerned with securing legal homogeneity in the EEA by, I should say, telling EFTA states what they should do. But there are a few problems on that way. I should hasten to add that producing legal homogeneity is not a goal in itself. It is trying to create reciprocal, equal market access throughout the EEA. That is what the ESA should do. And there are a few inherent problems. It is the fact that in the EU, directives have direct effect. That is to say, they come to work for individual rights immediately. And we also know that regulations have direct application. That is immediate effect. And there is no backlog in the EEA committee of acts waiting to come into the EEA agreement. So it is a sheer impossibility to deliver an equal market access throughout the year at the same time. In fact, that economic operators in the EFTA states have better market access at any time than do their opposite numbers in the EU. So, in fact, the EU is being extremely generous in many ways. The backlogs have been at times enormous, and it has not affected the market access of the EFTA states. This is something to be considered every day by the EEA agreement, and for that reason it could well be that it would be right to be a little bit harsher than is the Commission. Thank you.
I'm not sure I got the question. I'm not really sure there was a question. But if the statement was that because of the backlog in taking new directive should have as a result that the EFTA Surveillance Authority should be stricter in its control than the Commission is with the member states, then I totally disagree. I don't see that link at all, and I don't think it's logical. However, if you talk about the backlog, you will find that the report documents the backlog, I think, more extensively than it has ever been documented before.
Well, if you did not understand my question, I should try to improve you. When I said that you might consider whether the balancing act that you describe as a task for a successful work by the EFTA Surveillance Authority, then it may not be that this is put up for the right reason. The fact is that the balancing act cannot be actually performed, and perhaps it is so that the EU side should have larger expectations than the EFTA states in that respect.
Well, I think I answered that if that was the question. We call it a balancing act. That's just a manner of speaking. It's a balancing act. What we are saying is that the almost impossible task of the EFTA Surveillance Authority is to perform supervision at the same level and of the same nature as the Commission does in the EU towards the member state. It should not be stricter, it should not be less strict. If it's less strict than the Commission, then that creates problems with the legitimacy of the EEA agreement with the EU. If it's more strict, it creates great problems of legitimacy in the EFTA countries. And whether you call that a balancing act or not, you can call it by any name. But I see it as a balancing act. And we think that you have managed to do so, basically, for the last few years. I do not think you should be stricter for any reason, particularly not the backlog.
Could I just point another factor? Of course, it's obvious to many of you that the Commission is not necessarily exactly the same as the EFTA Surveillance Authority. The Commission also have some other functions to it, so it's a policy development institution, etc. Whereas the EFTA Surveillance Authority is more of a monitoring body, and so it's not easy to compare these things. So in our discussion we separate between three different roles the EFTA Surveillance Authority has. Partly it's an advisor helping to guide the Norwegian and Icelandic and Liechtenstein government to make the right choices, as they do in state, etc. And then it's a monitoring body, and it's also sometimes a negotiator, trying to find negotiated solutions. And I guess Bodenbacher the other day, earlier today, was critical to the negotiating role of the EFTA Surveillance Authority. But after all, that's one of the key elements to make to increase the compliance or application and legitimacy of the agreement. And I think we should have had the now we had the picture of, isn't it? This is your predecessor, or it's Bjørn Grydland here acting in the capacity of the EFTA as an EFTA as the president of the EFTA Surveillance Authority, negotiating together on the state aid Sure.
Thank you. I'm Elin Østby Hansen, and I'm the Norwegian ambassador for WTO and EFTA in Geneva. And thank you very much for the second presentation for me today, and the additional information from Ulf. My question is more sort of an overall nature. You start your report with pinpointing the changes that are going on in the EU for the time being, and then one of your conclusions is that you believe that Norway will come a half to 3 steps behind EU also in the years or the decades to come. So my question is, to what extent have you taken into consideration the major changes in economic power in the world that's taking place also outside the EU? The power games, the markets, the developments that might take place in the near future that will make the EU markets look different and then have a different value for Norwegian export, even if 70% of trade are going to the EU today. This is the main issue now in the WTO. And the way I heard your answer is that it was nearly closely focused to what is happening in the EU, but in a kind of vacuum as to what is happening in the world, and in the WTO the situation is more that the EU is somewhat losing negotiating clout and importance in the negotiations. And if you allow me, let me just, I can't resist a comment on your...
Sorry about that.
I can't resist a final comment on your comments on the salmon case with the EU, and the comment regarding that it would be easier to have agreements and understanding with the EU than with the US. I don't personally think so, and one of the reasons is that I had recently a very good conversation with Pascal Lamy, who used to be the EU Trade Commissioner and is now the head of the WTO, and he said that when he was the commissioner in Brussels, he was sitting there hoping and praying that Norway would take the case to the WTO, because we seem to believe that we were inside, but in Brussels they believe that we are outside, so that was the only way. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. To the last comment or question, I should just say that this is interesting, and we are not, I think perhaps we are giving the impression that we are making very categorical statements on the fishery issues of the salmon case. We are not in the report. We are just describing theories that have been launched, the problem. We are looking basically, we are describing the process and the battle, and then we just refer to arguments which has been made. We do not take a position. We have not had a big argument. It's a very complicated story, first and foremost. As to your questions, or whether we, as ambassador to the WTO, of course you lack something about the WTO. There's almost nothing about the WTO in this report. There's almost nothing on China. There's almost nothing on the emerging markets. And we are, of course, aware that this is the big issue in international economics and trade at the moment. And you could say, if you wanted to be critical, that we are writing this report in a vacuum in that regard, because we are writing about trade and the economic relations with the EU, but not with the rest of the world. So I take that, and that's if we had 900 pages more and a couple of years more, we could have included that, and that would have made for a better report. Having said that, I would say first that in chapter 14 on the economy, there are a number of tables, graphs, figures that also give comparative information about trade with the rest of the world and relations with emerging markets, etc. And I think one of the main points that we are making, and this we are making in chapter 14 and 15, is that even if all the talk back home among professors of economies about emerging markets and China, etc., it's still the EU that matters most. And this is a main message of the report. And we had one, and she's very good, a professor of economics in the committee, Karl-Helene Ulf, and she had this in the paper yesterday. Forget about China. It's the EU, stupid. I mean, you can talk as much as you like about China, but it's very marginal from a trade relation, even if it's growing at the moment. No, it might grow, it might stop. Japan stopped. It might stop, it might grow. We don't know that. But at the moment, and for these last 20 years, EU has, and the remarkable thing, which we are saying in chapter 14, even if, I know we're just talking about trade in goods and perhaps a little bit in services. We're not talking about investment and migration of labor, etc., etc. But we are saying that when it comes to trade in goods, and the amazing thing is really that in these at least the last 10 years of emerging markets and growing international trade, is fairly stable, the relationship to the proportion which goes to the rest of the EU. So this we are saying, and this is more amazing. And when it comes to investment and labor migration, of course, it's rising rapidly with the rest of the EU compared to the rest of the world. So this is part of, another part of what we're saying in the economist chapter is that one thing is the value of cross-border trade in goods, services, people migrating, investment, etc. Another very important aspect of the EEA agreement is the internal domestic economic effects of the agreement through the rules on state aid, public procurement, competition, etc., which are perhaps even larger for the domestic policy than the cross-border activity. Most of the cases, I used to work for the Attorney General, most of my cases were not cross-border cases, the EEA cases. Most of the EEA cases before Norwegian court are domestic cases, and you find a little bit of a potential cross-border element in order to justify bringing in the EEA agreement, but in reality they are domestic Norwegian cases.
Can I have just two other points that we make in the report, and I think that's quite interesting, is that not only is China a rather modest part, but this is also very good for the Norwegian economy. If the Norwegian economy had traded much more extensively services or in goods with China, it would have been much more vulnerable to competition. It would be much harsher requirements for changes, adaptations in the Norwegian economy. So it's not only the level limited, but it's also this is effective for the Norwegian economy, at least to some extent. I see some very well-known economists shake their heads there. But the other point that we touch upon the global side to it, and I think that's an emerging important element of Norway's relationship to the Europe, is the pension fund global. It's regionally weighted today, so 55% of the, or 50% of the stocks and 60% of the bonds are weighted towards Europe, investing in Europe. Whereas the Norwegian bank, central bank, is considering or advising the Ministry of Finance to change the regional profile to start investing more in emerging markets, taking on more risks, but at the same time this would be an element of the Norwegian government's, or not the government, or the bank's policy towards Europe. I think that would be interesting in the future for discussing.
And it's interesting, we are really, you could make a question mark whether this is the elephant in the room at the moment for Norwegian EU policy, that we are considering taking capital out of Europe at the time where Europe needs capital the most.
Philip Speitler, I have a question. I'm a legal secretary at the EFTA Court, and since you were referring to the EFTA Court, I just wanted to make a comment and ask you a question. You were saying your overall assessment was that the EFTA Court has contributed largely to the success of the EEA Agreement. But then you were mentioning the sentence we heard quite a lot now, that the EFTA Court is more Catholic than the Pope. According to my view, this would require an overall assessment of the case law of the EFTA Court. As far as I'm aware, there is no overall assessment of the EFTA Court's judiciary so far. Yeah, there is some, but no overall in-depth assessment according to this point. And my impression is that one refers to only a few cases. This, I don't know, but I have the impression that the overall assessment is lacking. So I wonder, and this is my question, complementing my comment, if you could elaborate on the empirical evidence on what you just said, putting a question mark on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
I can do it very briefly. As I was saying, the committee has not gone into this. We have not done this review, but we are referring to an assessment which was made by a Norwegian legal scholar, Halvard Haukland Fredriksen, in a very large, extensive article in Tidsskrift for Rettsvitenskap 2 years ago, in which he is reviewing in depth, it's about 80-90 pages, he's reviewing every case of the EFTA Court. It's not that many, so it's not so impossible. He's reviewing every case of the EFTA Court over the course since 1994, and he's an extreme, as I would say, as a professor of law, it's an extremely, I'm a professor of law, and I did not write this article, and I'm not given to praise easily for colleagues, especially not in Bergen. This is an extremely good article. It's a very convincing for me article, and it reflects absolutely everything I've thought but not documented myself over the course of the last 20 years working with this. So it's a very good article. It's there. It's unfortunately in Norwegian, and we are saying very clearly in the report we are not doing this exercise. We are saying there has been an article by this, and we are referring to the article, and we are saying if we're not even saying the article is right, we're saying if this article is right, which I profoundly think it is, then that's the challenge for the EFTA Court. That's it. So this study exists. It should be translated. Okay. Yeah. We can take a couple. It's first you and then it's you. Okay.
Nils Beckers of NHO. I see a parallel. Your report is well written. The EEA agreement and all the other agreements, they work fine. Your report is fat, as we now know. The agreements are comprehensive. I think it's more polite to say. You have a fish. The head would correspond to the nice intentions. The fat part of it would be all the provisions of the agreements. And the tail is unfortunately a little bit small. It hasn't got much force to it, perhaps. I really hope your report will create more debate than the EA and the other agreements. Then. That was my comment. I have a question on democratic deficit. You mentioned the arrest warrant. Do you see a democratic deficit at the level of the absence of debate by politicians in Norway? And lastly, Fredrik, you owe us an explanation of the Pac-Man.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. We can take two, and then I'll ask to speed it up a bit.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Harald Nybø. I'm from the Norwegian Ministry of Education and Research. I was wondering if, because on several occasions in the past, at least within the EFTA circle, it has been mentioned that we should at least discuss the possibility of renegotiating the agreement. Because of all the important changes that have taken place in the EU and with new agreements coming on, is this something that you have discussed in your report? If this is something that we should try to aim for? In the past, we have at least in the EFTA circle said that we should be extremely careful with that because we know what we have, but we don't know what we will actually get if we are to try to renegotiate the agreement as such. So I would appreciate some comments on that possibility. Thank you.
Okay, I'll take the last question first, and then we take the first one afterwards. Yes, it's true that there has been a debate for coming and going on whether one should try from the EFTA side to renegotiate the main part of the EEA agreement. Of course, the EEA agreement is dynamic because it takes on ever more legal acts and it's interpreted, but the main part is static. It's not dynamic and it has not been changed since 1992, and this creates a tension between institutional tension between the main part of the agreement and of course the EU treaties, which are changed all the time. So, and there was a debate, as you know, and many people in the room know, there was a proposal about 10 years ago, both from Norway and even more so, I think, from Iceland, to try to renegotiate. But in our report from Iceland, it is stated that the Icelandic government really wanted to push it, and they were disappointed because they did not think they got the necessary support from the Norwegian government. And of course, it ended up in nothing, and the EU said that they were too busy with enlargement and other things at the moment. And since then, to my knowledge, this debate has not really been taken up again for the last 10 years. And of course, there are warnings. We are addressing it, but in a slightly different perspective. You could take up again the 10-year-old, should we just renegotiate the main part? We do not really go into that from that perspective, but what we do in the end, as Ulf was saying, in the end of the report, is that we discuss whether one should try to make new frameworks around the existing, whether one big framework or several of the smaller frameworks. And I think personally that's the way this will come back, if it comes back. It will come back in the question, should we take the Schengen agreement? Know that Liechtenstein and Iceland always, but Liechtenstein is also part of the Schengen. And Schengen has been taken out of it's no longer third pillar, it's all one. Should we take the Schengen agreement into the EEA agreement, for example? And if we did so, of course, we could modernize the main part of the agreement and put in some of the culture and the nice stuff that we haven't got into it at the moment. So the answer is we are not discussing just revising the main part. We are discussing changing the framework. But it's part of the same discussion, but in a more modern form. And it includes all the pros and cons that you were talking about. You will open Pandora's box of problems. And this is where we have the pro and con discussion. And the cons start with, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And it goes on to listing up all the problems we could encounter if we started negotiating with 27 countries on the other side, and in a much weaker position than we had 20 years ago. But there are pros to this as well, and then you can read about it in the report. As to the other, I was intrigued by the comment on the correspondence between the report and the EEA agreement. I thank you for that. I will consider it whether I agree or not. It's a new. We haven't thought about it like that before. the lack of the democratic deficit. When we are discussing the democratic deficit of the agreement, we try to go beyond the concept of democracy as a vague and general concept, and we try to look more concretely at different aspects of democracy and how they are served or not served under the current arrangement. And we make 4 categories of a well-functioning democracy: representation and participation, political accountability and control, open public discourse and knowledge, and rule of law and rights of citizens. And on the first 3 of these, the EEA and Schengen, etc., arrangement scores very badly. There's almost no representation and participation, or at least very little. There's little political accountability, at least in Norway, in the sense that the Parliament is not really able to hold the executive accountable for European policy because of this arrangement. And third, and that's your question, there is a lack of public discourse and awareness in many areas. In some areas there is public awareness. People in Norway know a lot about the data retention directive because we have 3 years of unproportional debate on that. But for example, they know almost nothing about all the agreement, the Schengen Agreement, the Dublin Agreement, and the huge area of cooperation when it comes to justice and home affairs. They also know very little about Norwegian association in security and foreign policy of the EU, etc., etc. So yes, we discuss this. We try to map to what extent has, for example, justice and home affairs been debated in Norwegian Parliament, and what do these debates look like? Does people know about it? And in this chapter, in particular, justice and home affairs, we conclude very strongly that there is no real democratic public discourse in this field. So yes, and the Pac-Man. Yes, the Pac-Man. Ulf should really, but the Pac-Man. We have a symbol which is a Pac-Man eating something like a piece of. It can be interpreted. The Pac-Man comes from. I don't know if you made it yourself, but there's a theory. It comes from. You could see the Pac-Man as the EU eating up other parts of things, and it goes in particular towards the question of European associations and organizations other than the EU. You have 20, 30, 40 years ago, you had all these looser European organizations, and then comes the EU and the Pac-Man, and they start space agency, they start security and defense, and they start this and that, aviation, etc., and it kind of eats up the other European associations. And for the third countries like Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, this is a problem because we were members of the Western Union, but then they create security and defense, and we had to get into that some way, and then we have to negotiate in order to get into association with the European Defence Agency or the European aviation, and this is the Pac-Man symbol. So we have used it in our logo, which we've had for 2 years, but we kind of disguised it as a kind of cake diagram. But now we take it out and we use it here, and it's the Pac-Man, it's the EU Pac-Man.
Thank you. I had one question and maybe a small comment for the Norwegian ambassador. The question is, have you looked, because we don't read Norwegian and we apologize in SEPS. We speak a lot of different languages, but since Marius left, it's no longer spoken now and then. So we hope to translate it ourselves faster than the government, because we think this is a report which is important for the EU. I agree with Ellen, with Graham Avery. The question is, have you looked at what is sometimes called the Canada syndrome? No matter what Canada does with the US, always is true what Prime Minister Mulroney then said: we are in bed with an elephant, and even if the elephant is good-mooded, when it just turns around, we are squashed. So how much does it matter? Because you would always have the problem of to live with this, call it magnet, or call it a hegemon, or call it whatever you want to call it. So that's a question I would like to ask you. That's a not so legalistic approach. It's more approach about dominance that is de facto just true. And a small comment to the investor, if you allow me. Had Norway, I'm not talking now about EEA, but had Norway been exposed to let's call China competition, although it is to some extent already, I think the examples you should look at is really Denmark or Sweden, who do very well in international competition, and even vis-à-vis China directly. So I think exposure to competition will change your economy, shift your dynamic comparative advantage, and you don't necessarily come out of that worse.
But sometimes you do. And I know one example, the ambassador can talk later, is a Norwegian company called REC, making solar panels, which has been completely, the Chinese were not in the market a couple of years ago, and the Norwegian company was doing very well. Then the Chinese government decided to go into that, and that's it for the Norwegians.
To your question about the elephant, you're right. The report, although we say that it's multidisciplinary or free of some specific disciplinary jargon, it's somehow the design, the way we designed the report. It's not legalistic, but we took as a starting point the agreements that we have, and in that sense, some of you might, for instance, find it strange that we don't consider the euro. What does it mean to stay outside of the euro? What would have happened if you... So we only write about the effects of the agreements that we have, not the things that we don't have. So that's the first one. The second point is, I also think this report is interesting because if you take seriously the idea that Norway is part of the internal market, this could be seen as a thorough sector-based study of the impact of the internal market. So that would, and I think many of you and I know the literature on the impact of European integration from different disciplines, but I think, not to brag, but I think this is a very thorough study of some of these things, of the study of the internal market. So in that sense, I think it would be risky to start translating the whole thing. I think then you have a few readers. But then let me say something about the dominance, the legal aspect. I think you're right in the sense that we point to the asymmetrical relationship, and this is partly related to the design of the agreement, but I think it's an undertext in our report that we say that, okay, the mode of association is important, but still it's a deeper value-based, interest-based relationship, and regardless whether you do this or that kind of institutional arrangement, the relationship would still be there. And Norway, after all, would still be a very small country. Probably would be better off investing quite a lot of being good in adopting to their neighbor.
If I could just follow on the sharing a bed with the elephant metaphor, this is a picture metaphor which is known to us as well, and it's sometimes been used in the Norwegian European debate, being in bed with the big elephant, and even if it's friendly, if it turns around, it might crush you. I'm not sure if it's a good metaphor. I mean, if you are in bed with an elephant, the question would be, of course, not to join the elephant. Is Denmark part of the elephant? Norway is not. Of course, any EU member state would be part of the elephant. So it's a bit strange. But if we do should we merge with the elephant, or should we? But you can look at Norway. You could look in bed. It's a big elephant, and we're a small mouse or something lying behind the elephant. But I would say we're more on top of the elephant. I mean, it's definitely not like it's not like we're lying beside the elephant, being afraid of being crushed all the time. So the first answer would be, our report shows that there is lots of space in this bed, even for an elephant and a mouse. So it's not like, oh, they are so big with a threat. It's a friendly elephant, and it doesn't move that much. It moves around because the EU is always in trouble and going up and down, and there is so much. The story of the Norwegian relationship to the EU is that it's been very stable. Whether it's ups and downs in Brussels or not, we have the same stable kind of distance. We are in the other side of the bed or on top of the elephant or whatever. So it's not really been a problem so far. But of course, if the elephant turns angry, it would be something else. That's a good place to stop, I think.
Yes, I think so. Yes.
Okay, yes, it's actually 5:30. Well, I would first just like to thank Ulf and Fredrik for a very interesting and also entertaining presentation. Thank all. And I guess I should thank all of the other speakers we've had in a fairly long day, and all of you, the participants, who are now cordially invited by our Secretary General to a reception out in the foyer. Thank you.